I stood outside the stained glass window of St. Augustine's Church, the chill of the morning pressing through my coat, trembling fingers clutching a worn black purse like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Inside, they were burying my husband, and I wasn't allowed to say goodbye. I could see them, my son, Anthony, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, standing at the front of the church where I should have been. His hand rested protectively on the back of his wife, Elena, who wore grief on her face like a well-tailored mask. A few paces behind, the priest droned on, his voice muffled by the heavy oak doors I wasn't allowed to pass. "You're not coming in, Mother." That voice still echoed in my head, cold, unyielding, like he was tossing out a stranger, my own son. I had shown up early that morning, wearing the same black coat I wore to my sister's funeral 10 years ago. I'd ironed it last night, as if looking put together might convince him I deserved to stand beside my husband's casket. "Anthony, please," I had whispered, hand resting lightly on his arm. I was married to him for 45 years. I need to be there. But he'd looked at me like I was dirt on his shoe. "Dad told me everything about how you treated him. You don't deserve to stand beside him now." I was too stunned to speak. It wasn't true. It wasn't even close to true. Had we had arguments? Of course. Every couple does. But I loved that man more than life itself. I nursed him when the cancer made his bones feel like glass. I changed the bandages when the home nurse couldn't come. I read to him when he lost his eyesight to the chemo. I held his hand when he was too weak to hold mine back. I never left his side. Yet here I was, locked out, like some mistress showing up to stir scandal at the last moment. Elena had watched the whole exchange, silent. But I saw the small, satisfied smile she gave when Anthony turned his back on me. She won. She always hated me. I could never figure out why. Maybe because I never gave her the full keys to the kingdom. I loved my son, yes, but I kept some boundaries. I never let her boss me around, and I never pretended she was more important than she was. And that was enough for her to spend years slowly turning Anthony against me. "She manipulated your father," I once overheard her tell him in the kitchen, thinking I was asleep upstairs. "She made him feel guilty every time he wanted something for himself. She hoarded control." Control? I gave up everything to make that man comfortable. I retired early to take care of him. I cooked 3 meals a day, even when my joints screamed. I canceled my trip to Italy with my sister because Harold needed a second surgery. But no one ever remembers those sacrifices. They remember the time I asked him to cut back on wine, or when I begged him to stop driving after his seizures started. Now, Anthony told me I made his last years miserable. He said this while standing in front of the very people who knew me as Harold's devoted wife for nearly 5 decades. I watched the eulogy through the church window like a child peeking in at a play she wasn't cast in. And it broke me. Not just because Harold was gone, but because I wasn't allowed to mourn him. Because the one person I raised, the child I loved more fiercely than anything, believed the worst of me, and was now parading my erasure as justice. The pallbearers carried his casket out as the organ played Amazing Grace. I pressed myself against the church's stone wall, praying no one saw the trembling wreck I'd become. And then, as if to seal the humiliation, Anthony looked directly at me as he passed. He didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He just kept walking like I was a ghost, irrelevant to his story. Elena didn't look at me, but her hand tightened around his arm, and I knew. They had rewritten history, turned our marriage into a cage, my love into abuse, my son into my judge. And I wasn't even allowed to speak. But what they didn't know, what Harold had known, what I was about to remember, was that the last word hadn't been spoken yet. I came home to silence. Not the peaceful kind that lets you nap with the windows open, but the kind that wraps around your throat and makes it hard to breathe. The house still smelled like him, that mix of sandalwood aftershave and chamomile tea. I half expected to hear Harold clearing his throat in the den or calling out to ask where I'd put the morning paper, but the rooms were hollow. And so was I. I dropped my purse on the kitchen table and walked straight to the living room, to the chair he used during his final months, the recliner by the window, faded at the arms from years of sunlight and love. And there, in that worn-out seat, I let the tears come. It wasn't just grief, it was betrayal. Grief is a private thing, sacred. But betrayal? Betrayal is dirty. It infects every memory. The image of Anthony, my baby boy who once brought me wilted dandelions and called me his best friend, standing like a guard dog at the steps of that church, it wouldn't leave my mind. His voice, hard as stone, "You don't deserve to be here." I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to make sense of it. And then, as if whispered by the walls themselves, I heard it again. Our son doesn't know everything. It had been one of Harold's last lucid moments, just a few weeks before he died. He'd been struggling to breathe that day, the morphine not quite keeping up with the pain. I was changing the sheets under him, gently, trying not to jostle him too much. He reached out and touched my wrist, his fingers weak but urgent. Our son doesn't know everything, he rasped, and then drifted into sleep. I remember brushing his hair back and murmuring, "I know, darling." He never did. At the time, I thought Harold meant that Anthony didn't understand love, the complicated kind, the real kind that weathers storms and stays when it's hard. But now I wondered if he meant something else, something more literal, something secret. Harold had always been deliberate. He never liked leaving loose ends. In our marriage, he was the one who remembered to check expiration dates and review insurance renewals. So why hadn't I thought more of that cryptic warning? Why hadn't I asked him what he meant? Because I didn't think I had to. Because I trusted him. And maybe, just maybe, Harold knew what our son was becoming. Maybe he saw what I refused to see. That Anthony wasn't just being manipulated, he was willing. Willing to believe the worst of me. Willing to erase me from Harold's legacy with the stroke of a pen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house, fingers trailing over picture frames and bookshelves, searching for something. I didn't know what. Some clue. Some evidence that Harold had left behind more than words. In the bedroom, I opened his top drawer, the one he'd always kept locked until the last few months, when he stopped caring about secrets and privacy. I pulled out his notebook, the leather one he used for everything from grocery lists to notes for our taxes. There, scribbled near the back, barely legible in his shaky handwriting, was a single phrase. "Call Morrison if anything happens. Anthony doesn't know." My breath caught. Robert Morrison. That name hit me like a match in dry grass. He wasn't the family lawyer. That was Dean's man, the one who handled the estate meeting earlier today. Morrison was Harold's old friend, a discreet, soft-spoken attorney Harold used for private matters, the kind of matters that needed to stay quiet. What had he meant by, "if anything happens"? And why hadn't I remembered this sooner? Because Harold didn't want me to. Not until now. I stood there, notebook clutched to my chest, and something in me shifted. Grief wasn't going to paralyze me anymore. Not when there were questions Harold clearly wanted answered. My son had humiliated me in front of neighbors, old friends, strangers. He'd taken my place beside Harold's coffin. Then he'd taken my seat at the table I set for 45 years. But he wouldn't take my memory. He wouldn't take the truth. My heart ached with every beat, but inside that ache, something else was forming. A quiet, relentless resolve. They thought they'd won, that I'd go quietly, that I'd shrink. But Harold had left me a breadcrumb, and I would follow it. Tomorrow I'd find Robert Morrison, and I'd learn exactly what our son didn't know. The sky was gunmetal gray as I pulled up the long driveway to the house. My house, or at least it had been. The place where Harold and I raised our only child. Where the wallpaper still peeled slightly in the upstairs bathroom and the back porch creaked just before it rained. Where, until last week, his coffee cup had still sat beside the sink every morning, waiting for tea he'd never drink again. The house looked the same, but something in the air had shifted, like it no longer recognized me. I parked behind Anthony's oversized SUV. He'd angled it carelessly, blocking half the path as though the driveway were his personal runway. Elena's crimson BMW sparkled beside it, waxed to a mirror shine. I didn't recognize the third car, a silver rental, probably belonging to the lawyer. For a moment, I hesitated, my hand still on the car door, fingers curled so tightly around the handle they went pale. A few stray raindrops tapped against the windshield, soft as whispers. I closed my eyes. "You can leave, Mia," a voice in my head offered. "Turn the car around. No one would blame you." But Harold's voice came through clearer. "Our son doesn't know everything." That had to mean something. I couldn't abandon the breadcrumb trail my husband had left me. I stepped out into the mist and climbed the front steps slowly, each one a memory. The time Anthony fell and scraped his knee here. The Christmas morning, Harold slipped carrying a box of decorations and laughed so hard we couldn't stop for hours. The night Anthony came home from college and sat on that porch swing with me until dawn, just talking. I rang the bell. I still had a key, but I wouldn't use it. Not today. Cheryl opened the door. Of course it was her. Her expression was perfect, poised, composed, not a trace of warmth. "Mia," she said, lips barely curving, "we weren't sure you'd come." I stepped inside without waiting for permission. "I was invited." She arched an eyebrow and moved aside. "Well, it's a formality more than anything. You'll understand." The foyer was filled with the faint scent of lemon cleaner and something artificial like canned air freshener. Not the warm smell of Harold's aftershave and freshly brewed tea. The home felt hollowed out, cold. I followed her down the hall, my heels clicking softly on the polished hardwood floors I used to mop on hands and knees. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. The dining room had been transformed. No tablecloth, no centerpiece, just stacks of folders and papers, calculators, highlighters. The lawyer sat at one end, quiet, reading glasses perched low on his nose. Anthony was at the head of the table, Harold's seat, his face buried in a legal pad. I stood at the doorway. "Hello," I said. It came out quieter than I'd intended. Anthony didn't look up. "We're about to begin." I took a step toward an empty chair. That's when he finally lifted his eyes. "Mom," he said, "this table is for those entitled to something." Silence. It rang louder than any outburst. I blinked. "What?" He gestured to the chairs around him. Dad's will was clear. Everything is to be handled according to the terms. This isn't personal, but it's legal. You're not listed as a beneficiary. Cheryl didn't even look at me as she poured herself a glass of water. My hands tightened at my sides. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that I'm not allowed to sit down?" Anthony looked at the lawyer, who said nothing, just blinked. "You have your own finances," Anthony added, voice clipped. Dad left everything in order. The house, the accounts, his investments, it's all accounted for. You're not included in the division of assets. "I was his wife for 45 years, I whispered. Cheryl smiled slightly. "Yes, but let's not pretend that was always a happy arrangement." The cruelty in her voice wasn't even veiled. It was sharpened, wielded like a knife. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Oh, come on," she continued, still not looking up. "You ran that house like a prison. You kept Harold from having real friendships. from making decisions. I stared at her, at Anthony. Is that what he told you? Anthony let out a breath through his nose. He didn't have to say it directly. We saw it, especially in the last year. You controlled every pill, every appointment, every conversation. I took care of him, I said, while you two took vacations and called once a week to ask how his will was coming along. Anthony's jaw clenched. We're not here to argue. You're right, I said quietly. You're here to erase me. The lawyer cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we can… No, Anthony cut him off. We're proceeding as planned. And just like that, it began. I was left standing at the wall, like an intruder in my own life. They discussed accounts I had opened, investments I had managed. I recognized every line on the spreadsheet and every check Harold and I had signed together. No one looked at me. No one asked if I wanted to contribute anything, to speak, to mourn. They just continued, calmly dividing the life I had helped build, while I stood there like a forgotten coat on a hanger. It wasn't anger that welled up inside me. It was something colder, something sharper. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't make a speech. I simply turned and walked back out into the hallway. The photos on the wall blurred as I passed. Our wedding portrait, Anthony's graduation, the family trip to the Grand Canyon. As I stepped outside, the wind hit my face and cleared my vision. Harold had known. He must have. The notebook, the final words, the sudden secrecy before his death. Anthony thought he'd closed the door on me today, but Harold had left me a key. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed the number. Morrison and Gray, how may I help you? This is Mia Lennox, I said calmly. I believe Mr. Morrison is expecting my call. The next morning, I found myself standing outside a modest brick office building tucked between a florist and an old diner on East Main. It didn't scream power or wealth. There was no valet, no sleek glass facade, just a brass plate on the door that read, Robert Morrison, attorney at law. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding. Then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The waiting room was quiet and filled with the scent of strong coffee and old books. A woman with silver hair and thick glasses looked up from the reception desk and offered a warm, genuine smile, the first I'd received in weeks. You must be Mrs. Lennox, she said softly. Mr. Morrison is expecting you. Please, go right in. I crossed the threshold into the office with trembling hands. Robert Morrison stood as I entered, tall and slightly stooped with time, but still sharp-eyed. His charcoal suit was well-tailored, and he greeted me not with sympathy, but with respect. Mia, he said, I'm so sorry for your loss. Harold was a good man, a rare kind. I managed a small nod. Thank you. I'm not here for condolences. I know, he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. You're here because Harold trusted you, and he wanted you to know the truth. That word, truth, cracked something in me. After everything Anthony and Elena had said, everything they'd implied, it was like hearing fresh air spoken aloud. Robert sat down and opened a locked drawer in his desk. He pulled out a thick manila folder, neatly labeled in Harold's precise handwriting. He came to me 1.5 years ago, Robert began. He'd grown suspicious of Anthony's behavior. At first, it was subtle, questions about your health, little hints that perhaps you were slipping mentally. I flinched. Anthony said I was losing it? He implied you had early dementia. He told Harold you were mismanaging finances, isolating him from friends, making decisions behind his back. He said it was time to protect Dad's interests. My stomach turned. I was the one driving Harold to every appointment, organizing his medication, reading to him at night when his eyes gave out from the chemo, I whispered. I gave up everything. I know, Robert said gently, and so did Harold. He slid the folder toward me. He didn't believe a word of it, but he didn't want to confront Anthony directly. He feared it would only drive him deeper into Elena's manipulations. So he began documenting everything. He gave me full power of attorney for a revised will, one your son knows nothing about. My fingers hovered over the folder. Why didn't he tell me? He was trying to protect you from the burden of knowing. He wanted you to feel peace, not paranoia, in his final months. And Robert paused. He needed Anthony to show his true colors, without any interference. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, dates, conversations, bank statements flagged with Harold's annotations. A section labeled Incidents of Concern listed each time Anthony and Elena had visited, and what they'd said. My eyes burned as I read Harold's shaky script. Elena brought up power of attorney again, asked me if Mia had been acting strange, said she looked confused last Sunday. I told her no. She changed the subject quickly. Anthony called while Mia was at the grocery store, asked if I'd considered a financial guardian. I said I'd talk to Mia about it. He seemed agitated. Told Morrison to update Will. Mia gets everything. She won't see this coming. She'll think I didn't do enough. But I trust Robert to make sure she knows the truth. My hand covered my mouth. Harold had known. All of it. Robert let me sit in silence for a long moment, then gently continued. The revised will leaves everything to you, Mia. The house, the accounts, the investments, all of it. Anthony receives a small trust, conditional on his behavior. But if he contests any part of it, he forfeits everything. I looked up. He'll contest it. Robert smiled faintly. Let him. Harold's paper trail is thorough. We have video logs, witnesses, even notarized letters from friends who saw the manipulation. Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness, but something deeper. Relief, vindication. He really tried to protect me. Robert nodded. With everything he had left. A long silence stretched between us before he spoke again. There's going to be a second meeting. We'll call it a legal formality, but really, it's the moment Harold planned for. Anthony will walk in thinking it's more of the same. He'll be wrong. I breathed out slowly. I want to be there when he finds out, I said. Robert looked at me and, for the first time, smiled with something that felt like pride. Oh, you will be. And I imagine, when that day comes, you won't need to say much at all. The office was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock above Robert Morrison's desk. I stared down at the folder Harold had prepared. Every page a map through months of lies and manipulation. My husband's signature stared back at me, slanted and slightly shaky, but unmistakably his. Robert leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, giving me time. He hadn't said a word since I finished reading Harold's final annotations, but I knew he was watching me carefully, measuring when I'd be ready to hear what came next. He let them do this to me, I whispered at last. He watched it happen, and he didn't stop it. Robert didn't flinch. He knew you wouldn't believe it until they proved it to you themselves. I looked up, lips trembling. But I loved them. I raised that boy alone for years while Harold built his practice. I scrubbed floors when we couldn't afford a cleaner, clipped coupons to keep him in piano lessons, skipped vacations just to help them make a down payment on their first house. I know, Robert said softly. Elena used to call me Mamma Mia when she wanted something. I continued, laughing bitterly. And Anthony? He cried the day I moved out of his dorm freshman year. He said, "Promise me you'll always be there." And now? My voice broke, but I didn't cry. I just let the ache sit in my chest like stone. Robert shifted forward and placed both hands flat on his desk, firm but gentle. Mia, Harold didn't do this out of cruelty. He didn't stay silent because he didn't care. He stayed silent because he knew you. He knew your heart. He knew that if he told you the truth outright, you'd have done what you always did. Forgive them, I whispered. Exactly. And that's what he couldn't risk. He needed them to show you exactly who they were without him around, because once you saw it with your own eyes, the cruelty, the greed, the entitlement, you couldn't ignore it anymore. I swallowed hard. He left me a letter. Robert nodded. One for you, one for Anthony. Sealed. Harold made it very clear, there to be read after the real will is revealed. The real will. The words felt strange in my mouth, even just thinking them. Robert reached into a locked drawer and pulled out two thick envelopes. Mine had my full name on it, Mia Lennox, in Harold's familiar handwriting. I held it delicately, like it might break. Do you want to read it now? He asked gently. I shook my head. Number not yet. Because if I heard Harold's voice in those words, I might break again. I needed to hold my strength just a little longer. Robert understood. He reached for his phone and began tapping out a few quick notes. We'll set a new meeting. I'll call it a clarification on some discrepancies in the estate filings. That's all Anthony needs to hear to show up with a pen in his hand and dollar signs in his eyes. I gave a tight smile. Robert glanced up. He won't see this coming, but when he does, it will be too late to rewrite the story. I stood slowly and adjusted my coat. I want to be at that meeting. You'll be at the head of the table, Robert said, where Harold intended you to sit all along. Those words, the head of the table, pierced something in me. I remembered Anthony's cold voice from last week, echoing in the very dining room where I had once baked birthday cakes and lit anniversary candles. This table is for people entitled to something. He was about to learn just how entitled I really was. When I stepped back out onto the street, the wind had picked up, swirling dry leaves across the pavement like confetti from some cruel celebration. But I didn't feel small anymore. I went home and didn't cry. Instead, I opened the wardrobe in our bedroom and began preparing like a woman going to war. Not with weapons, but with armor forged from grief, truth, and 30 years of being underestimated. I chose the deep navy suit, the one with the clean lines and the velvet trim that Harold used to call dangerously dignified. I laid it across the bed, smoothing the fabric carefully, deliberately. I found my pearl earrings, my wedding set, even the soft lace handkerchief embroidered with the letter H that Harold had given me on our 20th anniversary. I sat at the vanity and looked at myself. There were lines now, earned lines, not bitter ones. My eyes were a little tired, but sharper than ever. I had been humiliated, dismissed, cast aside like a relic of a story they wanted to forget. But they forgot who had written it. I had stood beside Harold through every storm, every hardship, every triumph. And while our son delivered his betrayal in silence, my husband had delivered me something else: justice. I would go into that second meeting not as a grieving widow or a cast-off mother. I would go in as the woman Harold knew I was. And I would watch as the truth finally took its rightful place at the table. I didn't open the letter that night. After the reading of Harold's true will, after the world tipped back into balance, if only for a breath, I came home in a strange silence that didn't feel like grief, not anymore. The house welcomed me differently now, as if the rooms remembered whose footsteps had shaped them. It no longer felt like a museum of memories or a haunted mausoleum I was trespassing in. It felt like mine again. I changed out of my suit, put on my softest cardigan, the one with a loose thread on the sleeve that Harold used to tug at absently when we sat watching the evening news, and I made myself a cup of tea. Chamomile, Harold's favorite. The envelope lay on the kitchen table where I had placed it hours earlier. I'd run my fingers along the seam countless times. The paper had softened under my touch. I wasn't ready to hear him again. Not until the noise of the last 2 weeks had left my ears. Not until I could breathe without wondering what cruel thing my son might say next. When the tea had cooled and the house had settled into its soft, creaking rhythm, I sat at the table where Anthony once built Lego castles, where Harold read the newspaper every Sunday morning, and where I had eaten so many solitary dinners after Harold's diagnosis made food a chore instead of a joy. And finally, I opened the letter. It was 4 pages, longhand. Every inch of it written in Harold's careful cursive, the slant of his words gentler than I remembered, as if he were holding my hand while writing. My Mia, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I wish I could have left you in a world that still had me in it, even for one more day. But we both know time isn't something we get to negotiate. I know what they did to you. I know everything. You don't have to wonder anymore. I heard the conversations. I saw the papers Cheryl tried to get me to sign when you were out getting groceries that day, the ones giving her limited access to our accounts. I know about the whispered phone calls in the hallway, the times Anthony said you were starting to slip, that maybe I needed someone else handling decisions. I heard my own son call my dying too slow. He didn't know I was awake when he said it. He told Cheryl it was taking too long and that you were dragging it out. I lay there, Mia, weak, barely able to hold a glass of water, and I listened to the boy we raised reduce my life to an inconvenience, and yours to a liability. It took everything in me not to scream, but I didn't want to spend what time I had left fighting. Not with him, not with you. I needed that time to protect you. You were always my protector. I saw it even if I didn't always say it. When the cancer hit me hardest, when I couldn't stand on my own, it was you who held me up, literally and figuratively. You read to me when the words blurred. You joked when I was bitter. You washed me when I couldn't bear to ask. And when I looked in your eyes, I didn't see pity. I saw love. But they, Anthony and Cheryl, saw weakness. In me and in you. That's why I rewrote everything, because I couldn't stop what they were going to do. I could only make sure they failed. I went to Robert Morrison in secret. I gave him power of attorney. I documented everything, every threat, every lie, every attempt they made to convince me you were unfit. You weren't unfit, Mia. You were my compass. You always have been. Don't let them tell you otherwise. Don't let guilt become your inheritance. I know you loved our son. I did too. But love doesn't excuse cruelty. It doesn't make betrayal gentler. It only makes it more painful. And still, I need you to understand this. You are not to blame. Not for what Anthony became. Not for what Cheryl did to him. Not for any of it. We tried to give him the best. Maybe we gave too much. Maybe we shielded him from reality for too long. But you never stopped loving. You never stopped hoping. That was your strength. But now I ask you this. Stop carrying the burden that isn't yours. Live, Mia. Paint again. Remember the sketchbook I bought you in Paris? It's still in the closet under the blankets. You always said you'd start again when things got quiet. Well, things are quiet now. Take a trip. Go to that cabin in Vermont you always talked about. Or the Italian countryside you never stopped dreaming of. You have everything you need. You always did. Don't waste one more minute doubting your worth, or mourning people who chose to forget it. And if ever you miss me, when it rains, or when you drink chamomile, or when you catch yourself smiling and wonder if it's allowed, read this again. And know, you were my greatest joy. You were my safest place. You were always enough. I love you, always. Harold. I didn't cry like I thought I would. The tears didn't come in a storm. They came slowly, steadily, warm. I pressed the letter to my chest and let my shoulders shake in the kind of silence that only comes from finally letting go. Harold hadn't just left me an inheritance. He left me the truth. A truth I had been too afraid to believe, too crushed to reach for. That I had done enough. That I had been good. That I had been seen. The grief was still there. Yes, but for the first time, it wasn't tangled up in shame or doubt. It was clean. It was real. And it was mine to feel. As the sun dipped below the trees outside our bedroom window, I folded Harold's letter and placed it in my bedside drawer. Then I poured myself another cup of tea, opened the sketchbook I hadn't touched in 20 years, and began to draw. The day I put the house up for sale, the sky was clear. The kind of crisp, unseasonably bright morning that made the world look deceptively soft. The light poured into the living room, illuminating dust particles that floated like tiny ghosts through the air. I stood in the entryway with the real estate agent, Darlene, who was already admiring the molding above the doorway. She had a velvet folder in her arms, hair piled high in a bun that had the kind of confidence I remembered from women who didn't second-guess their decisions. "It's a beautiful home, Mia," she said with genuine awe. "Lots of charm, great bones, people will line up to see it." I smiled politely. "It used to be full of life. Now it's just full of history." Darlene paused. "And you're ready to let it go?" I looked around. The wallpaper we picked out on a rainy Sunday in 1987. The floorboards Harold swore he'd fix one day and never did. The notch in the kitchen counter where Anthony scratched the surface with a metal toy truck when he was 4 and cried like the whole world had ended. I touched the edge of the counter now. That mark was still there, but the boy who made it had long since disappeared. "I'm not letting it go," I said softly. "I'm setting it free, and myself with it." She didn't push, just smiled and handed me the listing papers. I signed where needed, my pen steady, my heart surprisingly still. Packing took days. I didn't rush it. I moved from room to room like a curator of my own museum, selecting which artifacts to keep and which ones no longer had a place in the new life I was building. Some things were easy: Harold's books, my old art supplies. The blue ceramic bowl we bought on our trip to Oregon, the one we never used but always said we would. Others made my hands linger. Anthony's baby shoes, the Father's Day cards he used to write in big, blocky letters. A family photo from a Christmas 20 years ago, all of us smiling in matching sweaters. Back when I believed that love guaranteed loyalty, that kindness would be remembered. I placed the photo face down. It hurt, yes, but not like it used to. Not with that sharp ache of betrayal. It was quieter now. Like an old bruise, still tender when pressed, but no longer raw. I kept Harold's letters, his cufflinks, the old Polaroid of us from our first trip to the coast. Everything else could go. I didn't want a museum anymore. I wanted space to breathe. The retirement community was waiting. A quiet cottage on a tree-lined road, tucked away on a gentle hill with wide windows and a wraparound porch. The first time I'd toured it, something in me shifted. Not sadness, not even nostalgia. Hope. There was a garden plot in the back already tilled, an art studio with north-facing light, weekly Tai Chi classes, a book club that met every Tuesday. A woman named Gloria had given me a warm smile when I peeked in on one of the community dinners. "It's never too late," she'd said, patting my hand, "to start living again." Anthony called 4 times in the span of 2 weeks. The first was formal, almost businesslike. "Mom, I think we need to talk about how things were handled. I was blindsided. We should clarify." I listened to the message once, deleted it. The second had more performance. "I've been thinking about everything. I get that you're upset. I just think Dad would have wanted us to stay connected." He didn't know Harold had heard him wish for his death. The third was tinged with frustration. "You're not answering my calls. You're not responding to my emails. I don't think it's healthy to just shut me out like this." "Healthy," he said. The same man who sat me outside a church while my husband was buried. And then came the fourth, the last. He didn't leave a name, just his voice, quiet, almost hollow. "I guess you've made your choice." Yes, I had. And no, I didn't return any of the calls. I wasn't angry anymore. Not like I had been. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want an apology. What I wanted, what I had, was peace. He had made his choices. So had I. The difference was, I was finally at peace with mine. The night before I left, I stood in the center of the living room with a single lamp on. Every surface was bare, every drawer empty. The walls seemed taller somehow, like they were no longer bowed beneath the weight of our history. I walked from room to room and whispered goodbye. Goodbye to the kitchen where I packed lunches for a boy who would grow up and forget how often I said no to myself just to say yes to him. Goodbye to the bedroom where Harold and I whispered dreams, and where I held his hand as he slipped into sleep one final time. Goodbye to the dining table where they told me I didn't belong. The next morning, I locked the door behind me and didn't look back. Darlene waved from the sidewalk. The car was already packed. She opened the door for me. "You ready?" "I've been ready," I said. As we pulled away, I reached into my bag and touched the edge of Harold's last letter. The words had become something like prayer now, something I carried with me, not to read every day, but to remember. Live, Mia. That wasn't a suggestion. It was a legacy. And this time, I would honor it not by surviving, but by living. The first thing I noticed when I moved into the cottage was the light. Not just the sunlight, though it did pour through the large east-facing window in the mornings, warming the hardwood floors and casting soft golden shadows across the walls. It was something deeper, a kind of inner light, like the house itself was waiting to be filled with someone who had finally chosen themselves. The air was lighter. The walls didn't whisper old memories. They didn't carry echoes of arguments or the silence that follows a slammed door. There was no chair left empty at the dinner table, no drawer that made me pause in dread of what memory might spill out when opened. It was a clean slate, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the blankness. I woke early that first morning, my body still caught in the rhythm of the old house, where Harold would stir at dawn and I'd slip out of bed to prepare tea before the nausea set in. But here, there was no patient to care for, no son to serve, no performance to maintain. I stood barefoot by the window, holding a warm cup of chamomile, and realized how foreign peace had become to me. I let the silence stay, let it breathe, and I breathed with it. The days passed gently. I unpacked at my own pace, no rush, no pressure, just steady progress. With each drawer I filled, each photo I framed, each flower I placed in a vase, I reclaimed space, not just physically, but emotionally. I was staking my presence, not as someone's wife, not as someone's mother, as Mia. There was an art studio on the property, just a short walk down a stone path shaded by elm trees. On the first Friday, I wandered in, hesitant, feeling almost foolish. But the room smelled like paint and pine shavings, and a soft jazz melody played in the background. The space welcomed me, gently. I chose a corner near the window and picked up a brush. It was awkward at first. My fingers felt thick, like they'd forgotten how to move with grace. The paint bled too much on the paper. My lines were shaky, but it didn't matter, because no one was watching. And when I finished my first piece, a simple painting of the tree outside my cottage, I didn't critique it. I pinned it up on the wall like a child would, proudly. It wasn't about skill, it was about space, permission, joy. I began going every week. Some days, Janice would join me. She was in her late 70s and had once sculpted full-time before arthritis took most of her grip. Now she painted abstract shapes in loud, joyful colors and wore a beret like someone out of a Paris cafe. Richard, a retired botanist, painted flowers with his fingers. He couldn't hold a brush anymore, but he said it didn't matter. "Art's not in the hands," he told me. "It's in the staying." We never talked much about our pasts. In that studio, we weren't widows or retirees or women with stories of betrayal written into our skin. We were simply creators. I stopped needing to explain myself. That, more than anything, felt like freedom. Cooking became a quiet ritual. Not the frantic kind, not the clock-watching, portion-splitting, always someone else's plate first kind. But soft, steady cooking. Intentional. I'd walk to the small community market on Wednesdays, pick whatever was freshest. I made stews that filled the kitchen with the smell of rosemary and garlic, roasted vegetables until they caramelized, baked bread and actually let it rise without checking the time every 5 minutes. I set the table just for me. Candles, a cloth napkin, my favorite plate, and I ate slowly, not out of sadness, but because I was finally allowed to enjoy my own company. I rediscovered music, books I hadn't had the time or energy to read. I reread the letters Harold had written me throughout the years, birthday notes tucked into drawers, love letters slipped into suitcases during business trips. They made me smile now, not cry. I started planning a trip, one Harold and I had dreamed of but never took, Tuscany. Not for romance, but for joy. I ordered a guidebook, downloaded Italian language apps. I marked cities I wanted to visit on a folded map and circled vineyards Harold had once mentioned after a third glass of wine, eyes gleaming with wistful hope. I wasn't doing it for him anymore. I was doing it for us both. Because when someone loves you well, truly, quietly, steadily, they don't tie you to their absence. They hand you the reins. They say, go. And I was going. Anthony hadn't called again. Not since that last voicemail. The one where his voice cracked with something close to resentment. I guess you've made your choice. He was right. I had. And I didn't regret it. I didn't replay his words. I didn't wonder if he was sorry, because even if he was, it came too late. Not for my forgiveness, but for my care. He had made his position clear at the table where he told me I didn't belong. And now I sat at every table in my life without needing permission. One evening, as I closed the garden gate and admired the single lavender plant that had begun to bloom near the fence, I caught myself humming. It wasn't a song I remembered, but it was sweet, software, my own. I realized then that Harold hadn't just left me an inheritance. He hadn't only shielded me from cruelty. He had returned something that had been quietly taken from me over the years. My life. And now I lived it. Not waiting, not hoping, not grieving, living. For me. The message came on a Thursday. It had been 6 months since I moved to the retirement community, a place I now called home in the truest, most gentle sense of the word. The air here always smelled faintly of eucalyptus and honeysuckle, and the trees rustled with a kind of peace that felt ancient. On that morning, I had just returned from the market with a small bag of produce tucked under one arm, fresh figs, thyme, and a wedge of hard pecorino that made me think of the market stalls in Siena. My phone buzzed twice, then once more, a pause, then again. I knew who it was without even looking. Anthony. I sat down at the small kitchen table, the one by the window where I had taken to eating breakfast while the sun climbed over the hills. I placed the figs gently in a ceramic bowl, one of my own pieces from the pottery class I'd recently joined, and turned the phone face up. 5 missed calls, 3 texts. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. Whatever he had to say, whether it was remorse, manipulation, or a tangled thread of both, it didn't matter anymore. Because I wasn't waiting to be seen by him. I wasn't waiting to be validated or absolved. I was whole. I stared at the screen for a long while, my tea going cold beside me. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to recognize the moment for what it was. The last shadow. Then, slowly, I tapped his name. Blocked. Just like that. There was no thunderclap, no cinematic swell of music, just a quiet exhale, a boundary drawn, not in anger, but in clarity. People talk about forgiveness like it's a virtue handed out automatically, like it's the only way to move on. But I've come to learn that forgiveness, when demanded, becomes a leash. One meant to pull you back into a cycle of apology and erasure, where the abuser becomes the victim and the victim becomes polite. I was done being polite. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not excusing, and it is not owed. It is a choice, a gift. And sometimes, The person who needs it most is you. I forgave myself that day for staying too long, for hoping too hard, for confusing endurance with love. I didn't owe Anthony a performance. I didn't owe him the soft landing he refused to give me. And I would not, ever again, carve out parts of myself just to make space for someone else's cruelty. That was my final act of motherhood. Letting go, not of love, but of expectation. My life now is mine. In every quiet corner, every blooming flower, every stroke of the brush, I find new pieces of myself. I paint nearly every day, sometimes abstract, sometimes landscapes. Sometimes I let the colors lead. I've hosted 3 community exhibitions, small, yes, but full of joy. Women in their 70s and 80s show up with husbands in suspenders and grandchildren on video calls, all just to see something we created. I teach a watercolor class on Tuesdays. One of my students, a woman named Ruth, once said, "I haven't felt this alive since before my hips started betraying me." We all laughed. Art didn't just give me something to do, it gave me a new way to be. I've traveled more in the past few months than I did in the last 20 years. Tuscany was the first, then the Amalfi Coast. I walked cobblestone streets in sandals that made my feet ache and drank espresso standing up at crowded counters, just like the locals. I visited vineyards Harold would have adored and stood in the doorway of a tiny chapel where the candles burned endlessly, filling the room with warmth and wax and peace. And then I went to Greece, sat by the sea in Santorini, watching the water melt into the sky. I didn't cry, not once. I just felt there, present, whole. I met people, not many, but enough. A widowed musician from Lisbon who taught me how to pronounce saudade, the ache of something missing. But I told him gently that I no longer ached. I had already found what I was missing, myself. I don't think about Anthony much now. Not because I've forgotten, but because I've forgiven the part of me that used to believe I had to earn his love. He is who he chose to be. And I chose not to follow him into that hollow space. If he ever thinks of me, I hope he remembers the silence I gave him as the gift it was, a way for both of us to live honestly. Some doors aren't meant to reopen. Some mothers aren't meant to keep sacrificing. And some women like me, learn that leaving isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of self-respect. Harold left me everything. Not just in the bank. In the quiet. In the freedom. In the permission to start again without apology. He knew what he was doing when he wrote those words. Live, Mia. And I did. I do. I will. Every morning I wake up in my sunlit cottage. I stretch. I water my plants. I make strong tea and soft bread. I read books slowly. I paint freely. And I breathe fully, deeply, without shame, pressure, humiliation, or fear. I live for me now. And I have never, ever been more alive. Returning to a normal life didn't feel like coming home. It felt like arriving somewhere I'd never been, yet had always deserved to be. There were no grand announcements, no chorus swelling in the background, just the soft rhythm of days unfolding with a gentleness I had forgotten I was allowed to claim. Normal, for me, looks like this. A lavender candle burning beside my morning tea, my garden gloves crusted with soil and satisfaction, a half-finished painting left on the easel because I no longer believe everything must be completed to be worthwhile. It's the freedom to sit in silence without fear, the joy of an empty calendar and a full heart, the delicate miracle of waking each day and realizing that no one is waiting to take something from me. That is the life I live now. Not loud, not perfect, but mine. At first, I thought healing meant erasing the past, patching up the hurt, making peace with every person who ever wronged me, as if closure was a responsibility I owed to others. But peace doesn't come from resolution. It comes from release. So I stopped reading old texts, stopped staring at the photo albums, wondering which version of my son was real. The soft-eyed boy I rocked to sleep, or the cold man who watched me be pushed from my husband's funeral like an uninvited guest. I stopped trying to solve the riddle of why. There's no formula that explains how a child who was given everything, affection, stability, sacrifice, grows into a man who can look into his mother's eyes and see only what he's owed. There's no equation for that kind of detachment, and there is no cure for a person who refuses to see the damage they do. I've been asked, gently, cautiously, if I've forgiven him. Some think it's the only way I can be free. But here's what I know now. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. Forgiveness is not allowing someone back into your life just because they finally noticed what they lost. It is not sacrificing your peace so that someone else doesn't have to carry their guilt alone. Forgiveness is a private act. It is choosing to stop letting anger rot you from the inside. It is releasing the expectation that they'll ever understand what they did. It is untangling your identity from the idea that their cruelty was somehow your failure. And even then, it is a gift, not an obligation. I have not heard from Anthony again. No calls, no letters, no apologies. Perhaps he feels shame, or perhaps, more likely, he has crafted a version of events where he is the victim, where his father was manipulated, where I am bitter and difficult and undeserving of grace. I no longer care to know which it is. That, too, is freedom. I used to fear being forgotten. Now I cherish being left alone. I look at his childhood photos now without flinching. There he is, at 5 years old, beaming with a missing front tooth and chocolate on his cheeks. There he is at 12, holding a trophy he didn't think he could win. There he is at 17, dancing with me at his graduation. Those moments were real. They were mine. And I will not let his future self take them from me. But I also will not pretend he is still that boy. He grew up, and he chose who he wanted to become. He taught me something I wish I'd learned earlier, that love, even the most enduring, has a limit when it is not returned. That not all mothers should keep burning just to keep their sons warm. My home now is peaceful, not because there's no history, but because I no longer carry it like punishment. I paint every day. I garden. I teach a class once a week. I take long walks with my neighbor Janice, who's 78 and believes in wearing red lipstick no matter what. I booked another trip, this time to Portugal. I'll walk along the cliffs of the Algarve, sip port on quiet patios, and watch the sun sink into the sea without wishing someone was sitting across from me. I love. I laugh. I live. Not because I've forgotten, but because I have remembered who I am without anyone else's shadow. If I could say one final thing about my son, it would be this. Not every lesson in life comes wrapped in kindness. Some come with betrayal. Some come in the form of silence that never ends. But that doesn't mean the lesson isn't still a gift. He taught me that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks only I can open. He taught me that self-respect doesn't make you cold. It makes you whole. I no longer measure time by what I've lost. I measure it by what I've reclaimed. And what I've reclaimed is everything that matters. Peace, joy, dignity, and the unshakable truth that I do not have to be loved by everyone, especially not the ones who think love must be earned through submission. I will not mourn the son I lost. I will honor the woman I saved. And I will keep living, fully, freely, and fiercely, until my very last breath. For Harold, for myself, and for every woman who has ever mistaken sacrifice for love.